Helen Marsh stood on the porch of the most avoided house in Greystone, Vermont, and she felt the whole town watching her from a distance, the way people watch something they expect to go wrong. A rusted iron key, the only thing she had left of 22 years, sat between her fingers, and she worked it slowly into a lock that hadn't been touched since before some of these people were born. The November wind came off the hills and moved through her coat like it owned the place. Maybe it did. She had arrived by bus, one bag, $64 in her wallet, and she had already spent 44 of those on a sandwich, a night at the Millbrook Inn, and the second-hand wool gloves she now wore because the courthouse in Burlington had not been heated properly, and she had sat in it for 3 days watching men in expensive suits decide what was left of her life. Behind her on Coldwater Lane, a curtain moved in the Beaumont house. A truck slowed on the road and then kept going. Someone had called the property the Ashby Place for 50 years, though no one named Ashby had lived there since 1962. The locals just called it the house at the end of the lane. Some of the children called it worse things. Helen had been given the key with barely concealed contempt. Gerald's attorney, a young man with a practiced expression of sympathy, had slid it across the table in a manila envelope as though it were a consolation prize at a carnival. The property at 14 Coldwater Lane, Greystone, Vermont, is described in the attached survey. She had taken it without expression, folded the envelope into her purse, and thanked no one. Now she worked the key with steady hands until something deep inside the lock gave a sound like a bone setting back into place. The door swung open into darkness. Helen Marsh stepped inside. Greystone, Vermont is the kind of town that keeps its secrets the way old houses keep their heat, imperfectly, and only under certain conditions. It sits in the hollow of the Champlain Valley like something that rolled down from the hills and stopped, too tired to go further. The population has hovered around 2,400 for 4 decades. Give or take the families that leave after a hard winter and never quite manage to come back. The main street has a pharmacy, a hardware store, a diner called Patsy's that has had 3 different owners since 1988 but has never once changed the menu, and a white clapboard church whose bell rings on the hour from 6 in the morning until 9 at night with a kind of cheerful indifference to whatever is happening in the lives below it. In late autumn, Greystone smells like wood smoke and cold mud, and the particular sweetness of maple leaves in the last stage of their decomposition, when they have given up being beautiful and are becoming something else. The bare trees along the sidewalks hold their branches up like people waiting for something they've been told is coming. The light comes in at a low angle and turns everything amber and bronze before disappearing entirely by 4:30. By 5 o'clock, the streets are empty, and the town feels much older than it is. The house at 14 Coldwater Lane sat at the very edge of all of this, on a quarter-acre lot where the paved road gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to the kind of muddy track that discourages casual visitors. It was a federal-style house, 3 stories, center chimney, the bones of something grand beneath decades of peeling paint and neglect. The shutters on the upper windows had long since surrendered their hinges and been replaced with nothing. The porch sagged in 2 places. The front garden, which must have been planted with intention once, had gone entirely to wild asters and burdock, and the stubborn persistence of an old rosebush that bloomed every June without anyone asking it to. The town had avoided the house for reasons that had accumulated over the years like sediment. There was the story about the family who had tried to rent it in 1987 and left after 2 weeks. There was the rumor that the foundation was compromised, that the well water was bad, that the whole structure was one hard winter away from coming down. Children dared each other to touch the front gate. The postman left any mail addressed to the property at the end of the lane rather than approach the porch. When the realtor Gerald Marsh was hired in 2019, walked through the house for a listing, and she had come out pale and recommended demolition. Gerald had agreed, and then the project had stalled, as Gerald's projects often did when they were inconvenient. The house sat. The town watched it sit, and now Helen was inside it, alone, with $20 and a key. She had met Gerald Marsh at a Chamber of Commerce dinner in Burlington in the spring of 2000. She was 42 years old, the office manager for a small civil engineering firm, a woman who had built a modest and entirely self-sufficient life from scratch. She had an apartment she liked, a car she had paid off, a circle of friends who met for dinner on the second Tuesday of every month, and a habit of taking solo trips to the coast of Maine every August that she looked forward to all year. She was not lonely, she was not looking. That is perhaps why she relaxed her guard. Gerald was 71 now, but at 58 he had been formidable. He wore his success the way some men wear a good coat, as though it were natural, inevitable, earned. He was a property developer, old Vermont money extended through savvy investment and personal charm. He was funny in a way that made you feel included. He remembered names, details, and small things you had mentioned in passing. He made you feel that you were the most interesting person in the room, and when you are 42 and have been quietly managing your own expectations for a long time, that attention can feel like sunlight on a cold day. He proposed after 14 months. Helen accepted. She told herself the children, grown, all three of them, would come to accept her in time. They did not. Rebecca came to the wedding with a face arranged into polite neutrality and left without speaking to Helen. Travis did not come at all. Derek came and spent the reception talking to Gerald's business associates and watching Helen the way you watch someone handling something valuable that doesn't belong to them. Helen understood at some level what this was. She had read enough about blended families to know that stepchildren of adult age often resist the intrusion of a new partner, that the resistance was not about her personally, that given time, she told herself these things. She was wrong, and she knew she was wrong, but the alternative was to name what was happening, and naming it would have required her to hold it up to the light and look at it directly. Travis told her at Christmas that year, 3 months into the marriage, that she had no right to the house in Montpelier Gerald had bought the previous spring. That house belongs to this family, he said, and the word "this" drew a line she was standing on the wrong side of. She gave up the engineering firm within a year. Gerald said it wasn't necessary, but in the way that people say things aren't necessary when they've arranged the world so that they become necessary anyway. She began managing his rental properties, scheduling his appointments, and organizing the domestic architecture of their shared life. Her friends from Burlington tried for 3 years and then gradually stopped calling. Her sister in Portland sent cards at Christmas. Helen answered them. She had no one to tell how small she had become. She wasn't sure she had the vocabulary for it anymore. The divorce came in the spring of 2022, after Gerald had, without ceremony, simply moved on. He offered her a settlement through his attorneys that was, he explained, more than fair given the marriage's length and her lack of children. What it actually represented was 22 years condensed into a number so small it made her laugh in the car on the way home, a single, private laugh that had nothing funny in it. The attorneys had negotiated for 3 weeks. What emerged was the house on Coldwater Lane that Gerald had inherited from his grandfather decades ago and had never done anything with, because it had never seemed worth doing anything with. His attorneys offered it as though they were being generous. Helen's attorney, whom she had found on the internet and could barely afford, told her it was the best they were going to get. She accepted. She took the key. She took the bus to Greystone. She had $20 and the clothes in her bag, and she did not cry, not on the bus and not when she checked into the Millbrook Inn and not when she lay in the small bed looking at the ceiling, because there is a kind of grief that is too quiet for tears. It doesn't announce itself. It just inhabits you, like cold in the walls of an old house, and you carry it and you keep moving, because what else is there to do? What else has there ever been to do? The dust moved in the air when she opened the door, catching the weak November light like something alive. The smell was old wood and cold stone, and the particular closed-in musk of a house that has held its breath for a long time. Helen stood in the entry hall and let her eyes adjust. The floors were wide plank pine, buried under decades of grime but intact. The walls, what she could see of them, were paneled in a dark-stained wood that had gone black with age. The furniture, what little remained, was covered in cotton-drop cloths that had once been white. A grandfather clock stood against the far wall, its pendulum arrested at 2:10, and the silence it kept was so complete that Helen could hear her own heartbeat. She set her bag down on the floor. She had bought cleaning supplies at the hardware store in town. The young man behind the counter had looked at her with naked curiosity and said nothing. She had a mop, a bucket, 2 boxes of garbage bags, and a flashlight. She had picked up a camping cot and a sleeping bag from the secondhand store on Route 9 for $38 she couldn't really spare. She would make do. She had made do with less. The kitchen still had a wood-burning cook stove, intact. The plumbing groaned but worked. There was electricity. She found the breaker panel in the back hall and worked through it methodically until the lights came on, dim and flickering at first, then steadying. She tested each room. The second floor was sound. The third floor had a soft spot near the northern window she circled carefully. The whole house smelled of cold and age, but not of rot, not structurally, and this surprised her. Given what she had been told, she had expected worse. What she had not expected was the beauty. Under the drop cloths, the furniture was old, genuinely old, not antique store old and extraordinary. A mahogany escritoire with brass fittings, 2 wingback chairs in what had once been deep green velvet, a dining table of such proportion and workmanship that she stopped when she uncovered it and stood for a moment with her hand on the surface, feeling the grain. The moldings at the ceiling were hand-carved. She was nearly certain, acanthus leaves and geometric borders that no machine had produced. The grand staircase swept up from the entry hall in a long curve. Its balusters turned individually, each one slightly different from the next, the mark of a craftsman working by hand without a template. This was not the worthless property Gerald had led her to believe it was. This was something else entirely. And at the far end of the kitchen corridor, where the house met the slope of the hill behind it, there was a door, heavy oak, iron-banded, and on it a padlock, modern, incongruous, locked from the inside in a way that should not have been possible unless someone had locked it and then gone somewhere else through another way out. Helen put her hand on it. She left it locked for now. But she noted it. She noted everything. She cleaned methodically, the way she had always done everything, with patience, with system, without hurry. She started at the top of the house and worked down, room by room, cataloging what she found. She made a list in a small notebook she had bought with the cleaning supplies. She measured windows. She noted the condition of the floors. She ate canned soup heated on the iron stove and slept on the camping cot with the sleeping bag pulled up to her chin, and the old house settling around her in the dark, its timbers releasing the accumulated silence of decades. On the third day, she began in the library. It was at the back of the second floor, a room of floor-to-ceiling shelves that had been emptied of their books at some point, the shelves themselves left behind. The plaster walls had cracked in places and been roughly patched. The light from the single window was gray and thin. Helen cleaned methodically, top to bottom, left to right, the way her mother had taught her to do kitchens. She found it because the plaster sounded different. She had tapped along the wall as she cleaned, an old habit, checking for damage, and the wall behind the leftmost bookshelf gave a sound that was hollow rather than solid, not the hollow of a cavity in the plaster, the hollow of something built in and then concealed. She moved the shelf, heavy pine, took her 10 minutes to work it free from where it had sat undisturbed for decades, and behind it was a panel, not plaster, wood. A clean-cut rectangle about 18 inches square, with a small iron ring pull recessed into its surface. Her hands were steady. She pulled. Inside the cavity was a wooden box, roughly the size of a shoebox, wrapped in oilcloth. She carried it to the window and sat on the floor with it in her lap, and she undid the oilcloth wrapping with the care of someone who understood, without quite knowing why, that what she was handling mattered. Inside the box, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Beneath them, a sheaf of photographs, formal, sepia-tinted, the subjects posed with the particular stiff formality of people who understood that being photographed was an event. And at the bottom of the box, folded carefully into thirds, a document on paper so old and dry, it made a soft sound like a whisper when she unfolded it. She looked at the photographs first. A family, father, mother, 4 children standing in front of this house. In front of this house, the rose bush is clearly visible to the left of the porch. The shutters are on, and the paint is new. The father was a large man, silver-haired, with the posture of someone who had built things and knew it. The name written on the back of each photograph in the same careful hand was always the same. Elias Greystone, June 1928. Helen's hands began, very slightly, to tremble. She opened the first letter. The handwriting was angular and formal and difficult at first, and then, as her eyes adjusted, entirely legible. It was dated November 1931. It was addressed to a lawyer named Harmon in Burlington. It described, in the careful, restrained language of a man who was choosing his words with great deliberation, a transaction gone wrong. A deed to the property at Coldwater Lane, transferred under circumstances the writer called improperly obtained. A name appeared in the letter, Mr. Aldous Marsh. The letter described what Aldous Marsh had done with the language of a man who could not quite bring himself to use the plainest word for it. The plainest word was fraud. Helen sat in the cold gray light of the library and read for a long time. It takes time to understand a wrong that is a century old. The mind wants to rush to conclusions, to simplify, to arrive at the moral of the story before all the evidence has been heard. Helen Marsh was not that kind of person. She read slowly. She reread. She set letters aside and came back to them. What emerged over the course of that afternoon and into the evening, the lamp burning low, the stove ticking in the kitchen below, was a story with the density and sadness of something that had been waiting to be told for a very long time. Elias Greystone had built the house on Coldwater Lane in 1901. He was, by the letter's account, a man of considerable substance, a timber merchant who had founded the town's first bank, donated the land on which the church stood, and provided employment for most of the valley through the better part of 2 decades. The town had been named for him, not in his lifetime, but after, a gesture of respect that he would never know about. By 1929, the Depression had come for him as it had come for nearly everyone. His bank had failed. His timber interests had been liquidated. He was left with the house, the land, and very little else. His children had scattered. His wife had died in 1927, and he had never recovered from that in any way, the letters revealed. Aldous Marsh, Gerald's grandfather, Helen now understood with a feeling that was not quite shock but something adjacent to it, had been a business associate of Greystone's. In the winter of 1931, he had come to the old man with what he described as an offer of help, a loan, secured against the property, to help Elias through the last hard years of his life. The documents Elias had signed, according to the letters he wrote afterward, were not what he had been told they were. The deed had transferred, not as collateral, outright. Elias did not understand this until the following spring, when Aldous Marsh appeared with a different set of lawyers and asked him to vacate. Elias Greystone died in 1933. He was living in a rented room above the old hardware store on Main Street. He was 71 years old. He had written in those final months a will, a handwritten document leaving the house and all its contents to his surviving descendants, with a note that read, in the precise and undefeated hand that Helen had come to recognize, "As this property was taken from this family through deception, it is my intention, and my instruction to whatever court may find this document, that it be returned to them when the truth is known." The will had never been filed. Possibly it had been hidden here deliberately with the letters so that it would survive. Possibly Elias had run out of time. The document, folded at the bottom of the oilcloth-wrapped box, was signed and witnessed by two names Helen did not recognize and dated October 12, 1932. She sat with it in her hands for a long time. Then she went to the kitchen, made herself a cup of tea on the iron stove, and sat at the mahogany table in the circle of lamplight and thought about what you do when you find something like this. Helen Marsh had spent 22 years having her judgment questioned, her instincts overridden, her sense of what was real slowly eroded by people who were very good at making her feel small. She had emerged from that marriage with $20 and a house she had been told was worthless, and she had come to that house and climbed it and listened to it, and it had told her its secret. She knew exactly what to do. In the morning, she drove the borrowed bicycle from the hardware store into town and found the Greystone Historical Society, which occupied the back room of the public library and was staffed by a 73-year-old man named Clarence Tuttle, who had been waiting his entire retirement for someone to walk in with exactly this kind of question. His hands shook when she showed him the photographs. "Elias Greystone," he said. "I've been writing about him for 15 years. Nobody wanted to listen." "I'm listening," Helen said. Clarence called an attorney in Burlington before the afternoon was out. She had waited 9 days before she opened the basement door. Not from fear, or not only from fear. She had learned in those 9 days to read the house the way you read a person, carefully, without rushing, with attention to what it was showing you and what it was still holding back. She had cleaned every room. She had catalogued every piece of furniture. She had sat with Clarence Tuttle for 4 hours one afternoon, going through the letters while the attorney, a woman named Priya Mehta, made notes in a yellow legal pad with the focused energy of someone who recognized what she was looking at. The padlock on the basement door was modern, a master lock, no more than 20 years old, which meant someone had been here relatively recently and had locked this room. She did not know who. She could not yet prove what she suspected, that someone at some point in the past 2 decades had found this room and locked it to preserve it, or to hide it. The intention was unknowable. The fact remained. She cut the lock with the bolt cutters she had borrowed from the hardware store. The door swung inward on hinges that had been oiled, she noticed, far more recently than anything else in the house. The stairs went down 8 steps into a stone foundation room that was entirely sealed from the elements. The walls were thick local granite, dry as chalk, the floor hard-packed earth covered at some point with a layer of flat stone flags. The air was cold and still, and had the quality of air that has not moved in a long time. It smelled of stone and old fabric and the faint, dry sweetness of aged wood. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and turned the flashlight around the room. The paintings were stacked carefully against the north wall, wrapped in cloth that had once been protective and had done its job admirably. There were 11 of them. Clarence Tuttle later identified them as Vermont landscape paintings from the early 1900s, 4 of them by artists whose names belonged in museums, and 2 of them already in museums, listed as lost. The furniture was extraordinary, a secretary desk of figured maple that Helen could not look at without feeling something in her chest, a set of side chairs, intact, upholstered in a silk that had faded but not disintegrated, a dining sideboard with original hardware, a tall clock working when eventually wound, with an inlaid case that a Burlington appraiser would later describe as among the finest examples of Vermont federal furniture she had ever seen outside a collection. The silver was in a cedar-lined chest, a complete service for 24, monogrammed e.g., wrapped in cloth that had tarnished but not lost its shine. And in a flat archival box on the floor beside the chest, documents, land surveys, early town council minutes, personal correspondence between Elia's Greystone and figures in Vermont's early 20th century history, a collection that Clarence Tuttle, when he came to see it, stood before for 10 full minutes without speaking. "This is worth more than the house," he finally said. "I know," said Helen, the curator from the Vermont History Museum, who came 2 weeks later, put the total estimated value of the room's contents at approximately $2.3 million. She said it quietly, as though she understood that the number was not the point. Word travels in Greystone the way cold does, through every gap, unstoppable. By the 3rd week of November, people were talking. By the 4th week, Rebecca had called twice, leaving messages on the cell phone Helen had purchased secondhand that had the particular quality of messages composed to sound casual while containing threats. Travis appeared in person on a Tuesday morning, driving a car that announced its own expense, and stood at the end of the lane looking at the house with the expression of someone who has discovered that something they discarded has turned out to be valuable. He called to her from the end of the lane. He did not come to the door. "Helen, we need to talk about this property." She was standing on the porch. She had been repainting the porch posts, which she had scraped and primed the week before. She held the brush. "Do we?" she said. "There are things about this house, assets in this house, that belong to the family estate. Our lawyers are going too." "Your lawyers are welcome to call Priya Mehta," Helen said. "You have her number." She went back to painting. Gerald called that evening. He still had the voice, the warm, reasonable voice that had once made her feel chosen. He used it now with careful precision. He was, he explained, concerned about her well-being, about the pressures she must be under, alone in that house. He said the word alone in a way that was meant to remind her of something. "Gerald," she said, "I was alone for most of our marriage. I'm very comfortable with it." A pause, then the voice changed slightly. "There are assets in that house that were not disclosed in the settlement, our attorneys." "We'll find," Helen said, "that the 1931 deed transfer is legally contested, and that there is a 1932 will that significantly complicates your family's claim to the property. Priya has filed the relevant documents with the county court. You'll receive copies." She hung up. Priya Mehta had been clear about the legal landscape. The original will and the documented evidence of the fraudulent deed transfer were not, in her assessment, sufficient to overturn 90 years of subsequent title. But they were sufficient to make Gerald's family's ownership deeply problematic and potentially very expensive to defend, especially once the story became public, which it would, given the historical significance of the documents and the involvement of the museum. The settlement, when it came, was negotiated over 6 weeks. Gerald's attorneys worked hard and achieved very little. The house and everything in it remained Helen's. A portion of the contents, those with clear historical significance to the town of Greystone, was designated for permanent loan to the Vermont History Museum. The documents went to the state archive. Rebecca came once more with Derek to the lane. They stood together in the cold and looked at the house and at Helen, who was standing in the doorway in her work clothes, her hair pulled back, a cup of coffee in her hand. She looked at them. They had made her small for 22 years. They had spoken over her and past her and around her. They had treated her like furniture that Gerald had acquired and that they were waiting to discard. They had won for a long time. They had won so thoroughly that she had almost forgotten what it felt like not to be losing. She said nothing to them. There was nothing to say. She raised the cup of coffee, slightly, in a gesture that could have been many things. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door. The court proceeding concluded in February. The museum partnership was announced in March, and the local paper, which had covered the story with the breathless energy of a town, discovering that its history was more interesting than it had believed, ran a front-page piece that was reprinted in the Burlington Free Press, and then, because of the paintings, in a national arts publication. Greystone, Vermont, found itself being looked at for the first time in a long time. Helen had contacted Margaret Greystone Cole herself, had found her through Clarence Tuttle, who knew everyone connected to the town's history. Margaret was 71, a retired schoolteacher living in a small apartment in Montpelier, and when Helen called her and explained what she had found, Margaret sat for a long time without speaking. "I knew the family story," she finally said. "My grandfather talked about it until the day he died, but we always thought it was just, you know how old people keep old grievances." "It wasn't a grievance," Helen said. "It was true." The settlement Helen arranged, voluntarily, without legal obligation, designated a portion of the museum proceeds to Margaret Greystone Cole and her surviving family members. It was not a fortune, but it was acknowledgement, which is sometimes worth more. Margaret came to Greystone in April, when the first green was coming into the hills. Helen walked her through the house. They stood together in the library, in front of the empty panel where the box had been, and Margaret put her hand on the wall. "He hid it there," she said, "Elias, knowing someone would find it eventually." "He trusted the house," Helen said. Helen had begun the restoration by then, carefully, methodically, with the help of a local contractor who had initially estimated the job at more than she could afford and had then, after she explained the situation, revised the estimate considerably. The porch was solid. The third-floor window had been reframed. The library had been repaneled in new pine that matched the old. The stopped clock, once a restorer in Montpelier had seen to it, now ran. By June, Helen had opened the ground floor of the house one afternoon a week for community tour, coordinated with the Historical Society. Clarence Tuttle led the first one. 12 people came. The following week, 31 came. By August, she had a waiting list. She planted the garden in May, in the front yard where the wild asters and burdock had been. She planted perennials, lavender, echinacea, black-eyed Susans, things that would come back without being asked. She planted the rosebush in a new spot where it would get more sun. She worked in the mornings before the tour in old clothes, her hands in the soil, the church bells coming off the hills at 6 o'clock, the town of Greystone waking up around her. The same people who had watched from curtained windows in November watched her now from the open windows of early summer. They watched differently. There is a particular kind of person that institutions rely on and never see. They are the ones who arrive early and leave late, who remembers what was said in the third meeting and can find the file from 4 years ago, who smooths the sharp edges of other people's words before they cause damage, who absorbs the friction of organizations and families and households without ever asking anyone to notice. They are disproportionately women. They are disproportionately middle-aged. They become, in time, so fluent in the needs of others that their own needs become a language they no longer quite remember how to speak. Helen Marsh was that kind of person. She would not have described herself this way. She would have said simply that she was practical, that she was capable, that she was fine. But the 22 years of a marriage that slowly taught her to make herself smaller, the 3 stepchildren who treated her like an inconvenient addition, the husband who mistook her patience for contentment, all of it had been slowly building toward a moment that the people who diminished her had not anticipated. The moment when the thing they had discarded turned out to contain everything. We mistake invisibility for emptiness. We see people who do not demand to be seen, and we conclude there is nothing worth seeing. This is one of the oldest errors human beings make about each other, and we make it constantly, in offices and courtrooms and across dinner tables and in marriages that should have known better. Helen had been looked through for so long that she had almost stopped trusting her own substance. Almost, not quite. That small remainder, that grain of self that would not dissolve entirely, was what carried her through the courthouse and onto the bus, and through the rusted door of a house that everyone had told her was worthless. What strikes you when you sit with her story is not the money, not the legal victory, and not even the extraordinary accident of the hidden room. What strikes you is the quality of attention she brought to the house. She cleaned it when she could have cataloged it. She listened to it when she could have condemned it. She moved through it with patience and care because that was simply how she moved through the world, how she had always moved through the world, even when the world did not deserve it. And because she brought that quality of attention, the house told her what it knew. We spend a great deal of time wondering how to be resilient. We read about it, listen to podcasts about it, and try to identify the habits and mindsets of people who recover from hard things. But Helen Marsh did not recover because she was exceptional. She recovered because she continued. She got on the bus. She turned the key. She cleaned room by room, top to bottom, the way her mother had taught her to do kitchens. She brought to the worst chapter of her life the same steady capability she had brought to every other chapter, and she refused, quietly, without announcement, to accept that what had been taken from her was everything that she was. The life we are forced to start over is not a consolation prize. This is the thing that Helen's story insists upon, if you're willing to sit with it. The settlement that sent her to that house was designed to humiliate her. It sent her instead to the only place where she would find what she needed to find. The marriage that diminished her for 22 years stripped away everything that wasn't essential until what remained was the clearest possible view of who she had always been. She could not have gotten there any other way. This is not a justification of what was done to her. Nothing justifies what was done to her. It is simply what is true, and she knows it, and she holds the knowledge without either bitterness or sentimentality, the way she holds most things, carefully with both hands, not too tight. On a morning in late September, with the first real cool of autumn coming off the hills, Helen opens the windows of the front room of the house on Coldwater Lane. The light comes in at the low angle it will have for the next few months, amber and bronze, the color of things that are changing. The floors have been refinished. The moldings are clean. The grandfather clock marks the hour with a sound that carries through the whole house and out the open windows into the yard, where the lavender is still blooming, purple against the dry September grass, and the rosebush has put out a last few late roses that no one expected. She stands in the doorway between the hall and the front room and lets the light come in. She is 64 years old, and she has $20 less than she arrived with, and the house at the end of the lane is hers, and the town of Greystone is awake around her, and the clock is running. She has everything she needs. She has everything she has always had. She just had to come home to find it. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Tell us about someone in your life who was underestimated. Tell us about a time you were. This channel exists because of those stories. We'll see you in the next one.